So today we're discussing P, the so-called priestly source. Next Wednesday, a week from today, we'll be discussing D. P and D go together like ham and eggs. No, that's bad. Anyway, horse and buggy. They are a beautifully balanced pair, P and D. And then we'll be finishing up the Torah on Friday's lecture next week. So today is P. We've already met P, of course, in Genesis chapter 1, where we think that's the P version of the creation story. Whether P, in fact, is a continuous narrative source, or P simply has stories here and there, this point is not clear to us. So one open question is whether P is a full narrative like J. Assuming you believe in all these things, right? Is J is the master narrator of the book of Genesis? Is P also similarly have a large continuous narrative? This is, I believe, an open question. A famous question about P is the date. We'll come back to this again briefly in our discussion of D. Is the date. According to the traditional Bible scholars, P is exilic. Exilic. What does that mean again? Exilic is when, class? Post 587 BCE, when the Judeans are exiled to Babylon. So exilic is from the period of the exile, 6th century BCE. So the old view said P is exilic, 6th century BCE. It already reflects the destruction of the temple, the exile, the catastrophe, the reordering of Israelite religion into something we might want to call Judaism. This is the old classical view. A response to that view is that no, you've got it all backwards. P is not exilic at all. P is, in fact, much, much earlier. P is pre-exilic. Whether it's pre-Deuteronomy or not is an interesting question, but it is pre-exilic. What hangs in the balance in this otherwise impenetrable scholarly controversy? What hangs in the balance is, well, whether you like a religion of ritual or not. If you don't like a religion of ritual, let's say you are a German Protestant, a liberal German Protestant of the 19th century, then you don't like a religion full of ritual, then for you, P is late. It represents the last dying gasp of biblical religion. And if you are a Jew, for example, who likes a religion full of ritual, you would say P goes back into Israelite times. And if you are a well-disposed, benevolent Christian standing on the sidelines, you may be confused. I believe that's where we stand on the debate about P. We'll come back to that. That's the very interesting question. In the last 20 years or so, there's a lot of discussion about H. We don't have enough alphabets and letters in our alphabet stew. We want more. So now we discover that P is itself a two-tiered source. There's a P, and then within P there is H. I'm not bothering to go discuss what is H. H is Leviticus chapter 19, which is one of everybody's favorite chapters in the Bible. Write that down. Professor Cohen thinks Leviticus 19 is one of the favorite chapters in the Bible. That may be useful information after the midterm. We get to the final. Just remember that. And that is H. H meaning holiness. God says to the people of Israel, be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Leviticus 19, verse 1. That is a holiness source. I'll come back to that very briefly today, and I'll try not to come back to it too often. But anyway, that's a source of modern scholarly controversy too about whether there is a thing called H, and whether H, how we understand how that source fits into P. And last but not least, P and R is another open problem. If you date P late, i.e. if you think it's exilic, then some people have argued that P is the same as R. P is the mapping up guy, the guy who comes at the end and puts it all together and makes a book. Or not. For that. This is by way of introduction saying that modern Bible scholars themselves who believe in all these things, I am of two minds on the subject, as you know, who believe in all these things, can't quite figure out how to make everything fit. Right? In other words, there is much that is uncertain, much that is a subject of debate. Okay, that's by way of general introduction. Let's get that out of the way. P is best known for its legal materials. Right? The second half of the book of Exodus, when the narrative stops, you recall, the narrative stutters to a halt, and then the entire book of Leviticus, and then most of the book of Numbers, we attribute that to P, and the bulk of all of that large amount of material, the bulk of that is legal or ritual, not narrative, not stories. Rather, do this, do that, do this, do that, thou shalt not. Right, that's what P is best known for, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And we have, I think, 5 themes in this P legal ritual material. Again, second half of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. And here are the 5 themes: tabernacle, sacrifices, priesthood, purity, holiness. Each of these is a mouthful, and each of these could take in. People have written books on each of these, so we'll try just to fly quickly over this very, very challenging terrain. First is the tabernacle. This is an important theme in P. The tabernacle, let's say the usual English translation for the Hebrew word mishkan, right, which is the place where God dwells, or God's indwelling. God resides, or God's abode, something like that. That's the Mishkan. It is also called in various parallel passages the tent or the tent of meeting, which I'm not going to worry about now whether that's the same as the tabernacle or something similar to the tabernacle. But I'm just going to not worry about that and just move straight along. So, the tabernacle or the Mishkan. Typically, in the ancient Near East, temples are the house of the deity. Right, the house of the deity. This is where the deity dwells. Typically, we build the temple, and God, or the God, is in the temple. This is his house. This is his throne room. Right, God is enthroned in the temple. Or typically in the ancient Near East, in various places, we have God resides in the heavens, but God's footstool, God's feet, reach down to the ground and are in the temple. In other words, no matter what metaphor you use, there is a sense that the temple is the meeting place between the heavenly realm, the divine realm, and the earthly realm. That's what a temple is about. In the tabernacle, the centerpiece of the tabernacle is the ark, right? The Ark of the Covenant. And all of you saw Indiana Jones, so I don't have to explain that to you. Right, so the Ark of the Covenant, upon which were the cherubim, or in Hebrew, keruvim, some mysterious angelic-like creatures which apparently were meant to serve as a divine footstool. This is P's conception. How do we know that God is actually in the tabernacle? Answer, a pillar of smoke. There's a cloud, there's fire in this mysterious, and this is the very end of the book of Exodus. After Moses has erected the tabernacle, right, the tenant moves in. The tenant, God, moves in. How do we know that God has moved in? It's a big pillar of cloud, pillar of smoke that has marched into the temple, and Moses can't go in now because God is there. That's P's conception. Or fire. Maybe one's by day, one's by night. You can't see the cloud at night, so at night you have a fire, during the day you have a cloud. P, anyway, seems to discuss that. You and I might wonder about P's theology. If P really thinks that God is represented by the pillar of smoke or a pillar of fire, then where is P's idea of God as the universal God, the creator of heaven and earth? Genesis chapter 1. How do we take God and squish him, it is a him, squish him into a tent shrine represented by cloud and fire? P, don't you worry about that. Don't you understand how your theology has an inner contradiction? Well, how P would answer that, I'm not sure. We'll come back to that a week from Friday when we talk about theology in the Torah. I know the book of Deuteronomy, I know the Deuteronomist, the Deuteronomistic narrator, about whom more next week. English translation. The author of the book of Kings I know the author of the Book of Kings is aware of this problem. Solomon has just built a multi-million-dollar temple, right, for the God of Israel, right? Super fancy schmancy, gold everywhere you look, inlay, et cetera, et cetera. And then what does Solomon say at his introductory speech, right, when we're about to launch this new temple? Solomon says, "Even heaven and the highest heaven cannot continue, much less this house that I have built," unquote. So Solomon says, yes, this temple, for all its magnificence, is inadequate, because God, after all, is everywhere. So the author of that little speech, be it Solomon or not, I don't know, the author of that speech is aware of this tension. How do we take a universal God and squish him into a little building? P does not seem to be aware of this problem, or I cannot find any passage in P where he reflects on this tension between a universal God who somehow occupies religious space. And if you say in response, "But Professor, isn't that true? Don't all religions have that problem? I mean, how about Christianity? How about Judaism?" I would say, yeah, it's a problem. Okay, now we get involved in discussion of what is sacred space, or how different religions and cultures understand sacred space. If it's a metaphor, it's one thing, but if it's actually the house of the deity, then you have this mysterious tension, the universal God who lives in a small house. P seems blissfully unaware of this problem. Okay, so where does God live then according to P, the house of God? So while the Israelites are in the desert, they have the tabernacle. What is a tabernacle? It's a portable tent shrine. It's a tent, it's a shrine, and it's portable. The job of the Levites is to pack it up, roll it up, put it onto wagons, and carry it to the next destination, stop, unpack it, unfurl it, reassemble it, ready to go. So it's a portable tent shrine. It will be replaced when the Israelites finally get to the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, and conquer it. It will be replaced by a building that is built by King Solomon. King David having laid the plans for it, King Solomon actually executes. That's the story in the book of Solomon, in the book of Kings. Right, this is the glorious building built by Solomon. So we go from a portable tent shrine to a fancy deluxe building. That's the storyline if you read straight from the book of Exodus into the book of Kings. The problem is that we don't understand what's going on with this tent shrine. The temple, we understand what a temple is. This mysterious portable tent shrine has analogs in the ancient Near East, but at the end of the day, the biblical narrative is extremely cryptic. And it's not clear to us if the tabernacle was real or imagined. D, the book of Deuteronomy, does not know about a tabernacle. D does not mention a tabernacle. It talks about an ark, the Ark of the Covenant. That's in the book of Deuteronomy, but not the tent shrine. And when we get to the book of Kings and read the narrative as the Israelites enter the land of Canaan in the book of Joshua and Judges, and then they start to set up a settled society, the book of Samuel, and finally the book of Kings, we finally get to King David and Solomon building the temple, you have to ask, where is the ark? Where is the tabernacle? What happened to it? Answer. We hear about the ark, but we don't hear about the tabernacle. This has led many people to argue the whole thing is a fiction. The whole thing is P writing with his overheated imagination, trying to imagine the Israelites constructing some analog to the temple at which they worshipped while in the desert. Why would P make up such a story? What do you gain by imagining a portable tent shrine accompanying the Israelites in their wanderings in the desert? Answer, I'm not sure. My best answer is what I give you on my lecture notes. The temple is, as constructed by Solomon, laid out by David, constructed by Solomon, was a royal institution built by the king, something like the royal chapel of Henry VIII, right, under the thumb of the king. The priests, high priests included, are all under the thumb of the king. Perhaps the fantasy here of P is to imagine a shrine where there is no king. The fantasy is we are completely in charge. We priests run the show, and there's no king. Many scholars have argued, in fact, that building of the temple by King Solomon was a religiously revolutionary act, and that led to, or at least aided and abetted, the split of the northern tribes, who, you recall, after Solomon's death, break off. And they built, and Jeroboam, you recall, builds those two shrines at Dan and Bethel, featuring a golden calf. In other words, he's harking back to a different kind of worship. We don't like this temple that you built, Solomon. We never had a temple before. So some scholars have argued there's lurking here, there's a tension between what kind of shrine do we want. And P either imagines or embellishes or preserves accurate detail, I don't know, about a tent shrine once upon a time. It's not a temple, it's a tent shrine, there's no king in sight, we priests run it, and that is our model of institutional piety. If you don't like that explanation, fine with me. Then I'll turn around and say to you, okay, you tell me why you think P invented the story of a tabernacle in the wilderness, which we all agree on the face of it is completely implausible. To imagine how the Israelites, escaped slaves from Egypt, are going to come up with these valuable and precious woods, jewels, gold, silver, cloth, stone. Where do they get this stuff from? Not to mention dolphin skins. So the tabernacle is a problem. But that's central to P's vision of the Israelites in the wilderness. I'm also mystified that P does not contain a commandment anywhere in P, the children of Israel, in which God spoke to Moses saying, when you conquer the land of Canaan that I am about to give you, following the covenant with the ancestors, the first thing you need to do is when you get there is to build me a temple, because I'm tired of schlepping around this little portable tent. Unquote. There is no such passage in the Torah. There's no passage anywhere, certainly not in P, that God instructs the Israelites to build a temple. So there's a very deep waters here. There's something going on here with this tabernacle and the tension between the tabernacle and the temple. I'm not sure if I parsed it correctly, and I'm not sure that we have enough data to make sense out of this, but there's something interesting going on here. Okay. Number 2, sacrifices. What do we do in the tabernacle? What happens in the tabernacle? At the center of the Israelite encampment in the wilderness, we have the priests officiating in the tabernacle. What do they actually do? Answer: they sacrifice animals. Which animals? Either big ones, oxen, cows, medium-sized ones, sheep or goats, or little ones, birds. No fish, no wild animals, no impure animals. So a certain subset of all the animals created by God. This reminds you of Genesis, where Noah brings into the ark pure and impure animals, by which that passage means animals eligible for a sacrifice. Those are the pure animals. These are the ones that are offered on the altar in the tabernacle and later on the altar in the temple. Let's make sure we understand what happens at this site. So the priests are the ones, you recognize them because they have these long, sharp knives. They slaughter the animal. Footnote, we're not giving any details about how Israelite slaughter works. The only detail we know about is that not to consume blood. But actually, how they slaughter the animal, we don't know. So back to where we are. They slaughter the animal. Then the carcass is processed in different ways, depending upon exactly what the sacrifice is. The blood is processed in special ways in order to remove the blood. The blood is a life force, Leviticus 17. So you need to pour out the blood somewhere. That's described also for each sacrifice. Then the carcass is hoisted up onto the altar, and it is roasted. There's a fire burning there, and there's fat running off, on the altar, and it's a complete mess, right? Running off from the altar. And finally, we remove the roasted carcass from the altar. Sorry, it depends. Some sacrifices, it just sits there and gets burned up to completely consumed, which if you are a Marxist materialist, you would say is a complete waste of protein, right? Whereas other animals, other sacrifices, we remove the carcass, and then we have a feast. The priest gets some, the person who brings it gets some, and we have a feast. That is the worship at the tabernacle, as described in the opening chapters, the first half of the book of Leviticus, and then we assume the ritual as carried forward in the temple in Jerusalem. Among these sacrifices, some are private, some are public. Again, some are brought by the community on behalf of the people of Israel, or some are private. Joe, Israelite, shows up with Mrs. Israelite and their little Israelite kids, and they have a sacrifice there, which are private offerings. The most important of these is the tamid. The tamid is the continual offering offered every morning and every evening at the beginning of business day, at the end, close of business day, is the tamid sacrifice. Described in the book of Numbers. The tamid means continual. This is God's food, as is described in that wonderful passage in the book of Numbers, which reminds us of the passage in Genesis, where Noah offers a sacrifice after the flood, and God smells the sweet savor. Oh, I love a barbecue, is what God says. And God says, then I shouldn't kill these people. They offer me such sweet savor, right? I can't kill them again in a flood. I won't do that again. I like this too much. Right. So what I'm getting at with all this is that we, modern people, have absolutely no conception of the religious dimension of all this. We are clueless. We who go to the supermarket and buy a steak wrapped in saran wrap on a styrofoam tray, we are completely clueless about the religious power involved in slaughtering an animal, draining it of its blood, taking the carcass, putting it on the altar, and roasting it. If you take Religion 101, or Anthropology 101, you will spend time talking about the religious power of sacrifice because it's found everywhere in human societies. Almost everywhere, almost from the Aleuts to the Zulus. So the usual explanation is that ultimately these are all substitutional. I'm slaughtering the animal, I'm killing the animal because I hope that the God will not kill me. Right. Here, God, you have this dead cow. Don't kill me. The kind of substitution idea, what we saw, you recall, in the Paschal story, the Paschal lamb. Right? Slaughtering of the lamb is apotropaic. Remember that word? Right? Averts danger, keeps danger at bay. So many scholars, anthropologists have argued that's ultimately at the heart of the sacrificial ritual. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, I don't know. I'm simply saying that we moderns are so worlds removed from this world that we don't understand the religious power which clearly sacrifice had. I know that it had power because it endured for, 1,000 years, more or less. In ancient Israel, and in many cultures it endures still. The most problematic of these chapters is Leviticus 17. Leviticus 17 says, any time you kill an animal for food, Anytime you slaughter an animal, do not partake of the blood, do not partake of the blood, do not partake of the blood. It's repeated several times in that chapter. Except you need to bring it to the altar. Right? God has his share. You're killing a living creature. It belongs to God. You have to bring it to the central altar where to be slaughtered and roasted. Now, if you imagine the Israelites living in the tabernacle, living in the wilderness, well, they're living in the encampment, and there is a tent of meeting in the middle. So I guess you want to slaughter an animal to have a steak for dinner, then I guess it's not so inconvenient. But later on, when you imagine the Israelites living in the land of Canaan, where they're living in the entire, what we now call the land of Israel, and adjacent areas as well, then you mean to tell me that if I want to get a hamburger for dinner, I need to take my animal down to Jerusalem, to the tabernacle, and slaughter him? That makes no sense. So Deuteronomy solves this problem. Deuteronomy, as we will see next week, Deuteronomy solves the problem by allowing what we call secular slaughter, or profane slaughter. I can make a distinction between killing an animal for a sacrifice at the altar and killing an animal just for food. I'm allowed to kill an animal for food in my backyard, as long as I don't eat the blood. But I'm allowed to kill the animal for food. When I want to bring an animal to the deity, I bring the animal to the central shrine. That's Deuteronomy. That I understand. Leviticus 17, I don't understand. This is complete mystery. Who imagines that every time I slaughter an animal, I must perforce bring it to the central altar at the central shrine. Then I can take it home and have a hamburger. Or have a steak. We're all very puzzled. If P is making this up, and it sure looks like he's engaging in some kind of fantasy here, then what on earth is he trying to accomplish? And how does he imagine this being practicable? Answer, I, Shaye Cohen, don't know. I am much puzzled by Leviticus 17, and if any of you have any bright ideas how to make sense out of it, I'll be happy to hear you. It's very troublesome how Leviticus 17 imagines Israelite society functioning. So he's imagining a world in which everybody's living right next to an altar. Okay. So the first theme, tabernacle. What happens in the tabernacle? Sacrifice, slaughter of the animals, roasting, eating. 3, who does the slaughter in the tabernacle? Answer, priests, or Hebrew, Kohanim, the plural of Cohen, plural of Cohen or Cohen. So the priests of the tribe of Levi. In Hebrew we say Levi, in English we say Levi, which in the context of the book of Leviticus means Aaron and his sons. Aaron and his sons are the priests, and the tribe of Levi is bigger than Aaron. So we have a distinction in the text between Levites, members of the tribe of Levi or Levi, on the one hand, and priests, who are also from the tribe of Levi, but from a specific clan within the tribe of Levi. Priests are top dog. Right? Easy for me to say. Well, it's obviously true. Right. Priests are top dog. The Cohen reigns supreme in the tabernacle. Whereas the lowly Levites, they're very useful. They pack and unpack and are just plain support staff. Those are the Levites. So the priests officiate, they do the heavy lifting, metaphorically speaking, and the Levites do the actual heavy lifting, packing and unpacking. Modern Bible scholars, and indeed all of us, are puzzled at this system, how both Levites and priests both come from the same tribe, and yet one group is clearly superior to the other. And why we have this two-tiered system and how this came about is, in fact, a real mystery to us. We assume there was a long and complex story here. Right? There's a historical explanation for this, but that history is hidden from us. So, Genesis chapter 49, you recall, Jacob's blessing of his children. So Jacob, you recall, does not say nice things about the first three brothers. Right? Reuben is no good because he had some forbidden sex, so he's out. He loses his primogeniture. Simeon and Levi are men of violence, therefore they're not going to amount to very much either. Judah, number 4, he's the one who's going to be the royal one. That's the blessing of Jacob. So Jacob knows in Genesis 49 that the Levites are landless. But he doesn't know yet, Genesis 49, that in return for being landless, the Levites will turn out to be the priestly tribe. That's not mentioned in Genesis 49. But if you look at Moses' final blessing of Deuteronomy 33, then Moses knows that the Levites are landless, and he also knows that the Levites are going to serve as priests. Well, that's an interesting point. So something has happened between these two chapters. And then we have texts like the revolt of Korach, you recall, where you can see clearly tension between Aaron, or the Aaronides, Aaron and his sons, versus Levites. In that story, God clearly endorses the Aaronides, and the Levites are told to mind their manners and know their place. That's in the Korach story. Whereas you recall in the golden calf story, it's Aaron who is besmirched by that story, and it's the Levites who are the ones who are loyal to God. So I deduce from this that there is in fact tension between the Levites as a whole and the Aaronide clan in particular. But the Aaronide clan are the ones who achieve prominence. And the Levites somehow get stuck in second place. But we don't know how or why exactly this happened and how the Levitic tribe lost its landholding and became the priestly tribe. When we get to D next week, we'll see Deuteronomy regularly refers to the priests, the Levites, Kohanim HaLeviim, sometimes translated Levitic priests, as if Deuteronomy is trying to efface this distinction and say it's all the same. That's next week. So we have priests officiating in the tabernacle. We have Levites assisting them, according to P's imagination of the Israelites in the wilderness of old. How do you get to be a priest or a Levite? How do you get to be a Cohen? Answer, because your father is a Cohen. How did he get to be a Cohen? Because his father was a Cohen. There are a lot of old jokes about this. I won't tell you about the old Jewish joke on this one. Right. So you're a Cohen because your father is one. So it's what we call in the business a caste. Right? It's a genealogically or pedigree, a group defined by its pedigree. So it's a tribe, it's a caste. Most interesting, too, is that Leviticus spells out rules that in order to serve at the central shrine, at the altar, you must be blemish-free. Animals that you bring for sacrifice must be free of blemish, and the priests themselves must be free of blemish. Okay, it is the opposite of inclusive society. God does not want to see blemished people or objects. Away, away. That's an area where P's values and our values are very different. One of thousands of things, I should say. Okay. Okay, so we've got the tabernacle, we have sacrifices, and we have priests. That's where we are in P's world. Now we come to purity and impurity. The key concept in P, now we're in very deep waters, so we'll have to try to get through this quickly or lightly. The sacred must be protected from impurity. The sacred is a synonym for the holy. There are things that are holy and things that are impure, and we need to protect the holy, the sacred, from impurity. What does impurity mean? In P, one can contract impurity by coming in contact with a source of impurity. And P gives you, in those chapters I asked you to look at, It could be a human corpse. It could be a corpse of an impure animal. The process of childbirth, sexual discharges, either male or female, or a series of skin maladies, often translated leprosy, but all of us know that's the wrong translation. But what the right translation is problematic. So let's say some kind of mysterious skin disease, scaly disease. All of these persons-objects are impure, and they can come, and they in turn must be kept away from that which is holy. So if you are in a state of impurity or have contracted impurity by touching or coming in contact with a source of impurity, you may not turn around and enter into the temple tabernacle precincts. You may not eat of the sacred meats. If you are a priest, you may not eat of the priestly offerings. How does one get rid of impurity? Answer. P explains to you how to do it. Depending upon the severity of the impurity, you might have to bathe, wash your clothes, wait till nightfall, wait 7 days, or perhaps most mysterious of all, be cleansed by this mysterious mixture prepared by the water, the ashes of a burnt red heifer. In Numbers 19. I think we're in a world here similar to that of the world of sacrifices. We moderns look at this stuff and we are just plain flummoxed. What? That's our reaction. What? But that's P. The key point here to keep in mind is that these impurities are nothing to do with sin and nothing to do with dirt. I wrote down sin in the handout. I forgot to write down dirt. Nothing to do with dirt. I'll start with the dirt one. So menstrual blood causes impurity, but urine and feces do not. Urine and feces are dirt. Menstrual blood, however, is impurifying. You can be as dirty as anything from top to bottom, and you're not impure, according to P. So P has a very specific list of sources of impurity. Next, these sources have nothing to do with sin. In fact, if you're living a normal life in Israelite society, then impurity of the sort imagined by P is inevitable. And in fact, in some cases, is desirable. You have Israelites who are living a married life. Sooner or later, the woman is going to menstruate. Sooner or later, the woman, we hope, will have a baby. Sooner or later, the husband is going to ejaculate. In Israelite society, we dispose of the dead by burial. Well, sooner or later, you're going to bury a deceased relative, which is only proper and honorable. In other words, if you're living a normal life in society, according to P, you will inevitably, sooner or later, become impure. And that impurity is not a function of sin. That impurity is a function of I'm not sure what it's a function of, but P has a very clear conception of certain kinds of bodily fluids and body activities in the body cause impurity. And once you've contracted it, it is transient. Menstruation will stop. A woman has a child, you wait a certain amount of time, and she can recover her purity, her pure status. A man ejaculates, fine. There's a process by which very quickly the man can recover a state not impurity. This is P's conception of purity. We sometimes, as a result, call it Levitical impurity, because it comes from the book of Leviticus, has to do with Levites and priests, or sometimes we call it ritual impurity. So the key point then, it's inevitable, it is transient. There are some passages here and there, most famously Leviticus 16, which describes the Day of Atonement ritual, wherein we go from the metaphor. The metaphor of pure and impure becomes a metaphor for absence of sin or sin. But I think it's a metaphor. So Leviticus 16. The original function of Yom Kippur, or in English, Day of Atonement, which is not a good translation, because the original meaning of the word kapar, kippur, was to wipe, or to wipe clean. So the original function of the Day of Atonement was to wipe clean the central shrine from accumulated impurities. Because, after all, P imagines the tabernacle is right dab in the middle of the camp. The Israelites living all around the tabernacle. Husbands, wives, children, people are getting born, people are dying. There's impurity everywhere in the camp. So once a year we need to come into the central shrine and wipe it clean of the accumulated impurities, which are here imagined as a thing, as a polluted substance. The analogy I like to use is like your air conditioner. You can vacuum your house regularly and keep it clean. Once a year you got to change the filter, and it's filthy. There's accumulated schmutz, as my late mother would have said, right, all over the filter, all over the air conditioner filter. You've been cleaning the house, it doesn't matter. Once a year you got to clean out the filter. Once a year the high priest goes into the central shrine and wipes it clean of the accumulated impurities, which inevitably have found their way into the central shrine, and that is a dangerous situation. They need to be removed. That's the original function of the Day of Atonement ritual. You can still see it lurking in Leviticus 16. But that gets connected with then the metaphorical reading, in which the wiping clean of the impurity from the altar, and from the Ark of the Covenant, the central shrine, becomes a metaphor for cleansing Israel of its sins. And that's how the day of wiping, Yom Kippur, becomes the Day of Atonement. But you can see levels of meaning in that chapter between the two, especially in that verse, Leviticus 16, verse 30. I can't give you dates of when all these things happen. That's much too complicated. All of this we need to keep separate from Leviticus 18, which is also P, or maybe it's H, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. Right, in which we have a different kind of impurity. Here in Leviticus 18, we have a list of prohibited sexual unions, usually translated in English badly as incest, and sexual unions. And if you engage in these prohibited sexual unions in Leviticus 18, then what's going to happen? You are going to impurify the land of Canaan, and God will throw you out. So now we discover there is a new kind of impurity. The other kind was, you recall, inevitable and transient. Whereas this impurity is not inevitable at all. It's because you're bad boys and girls. That's why you have this impurity. And it may not be transient at all. It may be permanent, because God's going to kick you out. The same way God kicked out the Canaanites, God's going to kick you out also. But that also uses the language of impurity. Confusing, no? That's language of impurity. Modern scholars say that kind of impurity in Leviticus 18 is danger impurity, is sin impurity. Whereas P, other language of impurity, is referring to ritual impurity. A little confused? Well, read the two chapters. Read Leviticus 18, and you'll see what I'm saying, that this is danger impurity, not to be confused with the impurity caused by a woman in childbirth, caused by a corpse. Anyway, bottom line, language of impurity and purity, P, that's big in P. Contrast D, where it's almost absent. We'll get to D next week. 5, I got 5 minutes or 4 minutes. In addition to impurity and purity, P also has language of holiness, which might be translated sacred. Sacred and holy I'm using these as synonymous terms. Holiness. The holy is where God is. The holy must be protected from impurity. Let me explain this for a second. For P, holy and impure are not exactly opposite categories, but each of them are electric. That is to say, something as holy is suffused with the numinous presence of God. That's holy. Something that isn't holy just is lying there. It's profane. It's nothing. Similarly, something which is impure is suffused with this power of impurity, this danger, or rather, it's electrical. Where something that's pure is simply not impure. What we need to do is to make sure that the impure is kept away from the holy. You commit no sin wandering around in a state of impurity. Menstruating woman, a man after ejaculation, you just buried your late lamented father, you are in a state of impurity. You commit no sin by doing so, as long as you don't go near the holy. That's where sin resides. That's where violating the laws of God reside, is the holy. P has one of the most amazingly beautiful chapters in P is Leviticus 19. And Leviticus 19 opens with the injunction, as I mentioned earlier, be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Right. This is the state to which we Israelites are to aspire. And anyone who likes to make fun of the seemingly mind-numbing and incomprehensible ritual of P needs to look at Leviticus 19, whereas P understands the function of the ritual as a function of holiness. That just as God is holy, we Israelites are to be holy also. Holiness, then, is important to P, just as purity and impurity are to P. The opposite of holy is profane, not holy. The opposite of impure is not impure. As long as we keep these categories separate, P is happy, or P is content. As we'll see when we get to Deuteronomy, there's almost nothing in Deuteronomy about purity and impurity. That's not Deuteronomy's issue. And Deuteronomy also has something to say about holiness, and we'll see its language, though its rhetoric is different, as we'll see when we get there. Okay, everybody, our time is up. Wish you success in review for the midterm on Friday.